My daughter-in-law told the nurse I had no family we need to contact. No. The words, spoken in Catherine's smooth, dismissive tone, sliced through the sterile air of the hospital room and found their mark deep inside me. My hand, which had been gripping the thin, scratchy hospital blanket, went slack. The blood seemed to drain from my face, a sudden, hollowing cold that started behind my ears and washed all the way down to my feet. I could feel the individual thread of the blanket against my suddenly numb fingers, a distant, meaningless texture. She had said it as if I weren't even there, a piece of furniture to be discussed and disposed of. My name is Eleanor Vance, and I am 78 years old. The woman who had just erased my existence was the wife of my only son, Michael. But there was something Catherine didn't know. Something my quiet Robert had left behind, a truth sealed in a dusty cedar box in the top of my closet. She had just thrown away a world she never even knew she possessed. To understand the weight of those words, the sheer breathtaking cruelty of them, you have to understand the life I had lived, the sacrifices I had made, and the secret I had kept for all these years. To understand why, you need to know who I really am. My story, the real one, begins not in that cold hospital room, but in a small, sun-drenched apartment 45 years ago. It was university housing, smelling perpetually of old books, chalk dust, and the strong coffee my husband Robert brewed every morning. We were poor, but in that way, that young people with more ideas than money are. It felt like an adventure, not a hardship. Robert was a physics professor at the university, a man so brilliant he seemed to vibrate with a quiet energy, as if he were personally connected to the hum of the universe. He was not a man of grand gestures. His love was in the details. It was in the chalk dust that was permanently embedded in the cuffs of his tweed jackets, a pale gray reminder of his passion. It was in the way he'd come home, his mind still lost in a swirl of equations, and his eyes would find me across the room, a slow smile spreading across his face as he returned to earth. And it was in his hobby. Other men had fishing or golf. My Robert had the future. He would spend his evenings not with the newspaper, but with obscure technical journals from Stanford or Bell Labs, his brow furrowed in concentration. Ellie, he say, his voice full of wonder, holding up a journal with a dense, ugly cover. These fellows out in California, they're putting entire worlds on a single grain of sand. It's going to change everything. He called it his garden. With the small amounts of money we managed to save from his modest professor's salary, he would buy stocks, not in the big familiar companies, but in tiny, unheard of start-ups he'd read about in those journals. Names that meant nothing to me then. Intel, Microsoft, a little company called Oracle. I'd watch him at his desk, meticulously recording each purchase in a thick leather-bound ledger. It's a garden, Ellie, he'd explain, tapping the page with his pen. You plant the seeds, good seeds from smart people, and you let them grow. You don't pull them up every season to see how the roots are doing. You trust the process. I never paid much attention. It was his world, a place of numbers and theories I didn't understand. My world was more tangible. It was the smell of baking bread, the weight of our son Michael sleeping on my shoulder, the rhythm of our quiet, happy life. Michael's childhood was filled with that same quiet love. I remember him at 7, falling from the big oak tree in the campus quad and scraping his knee bloody. He came running to us, wailing. Robert, instead of just fussing, knelt down and said, "Well, Michael, that was a perfect demonstration of gravitational potential energy converting to kinetic energy, with an unfortunate coefficient of friction upon landing." He explained the physics of the fall while I cleaned the wound and kissed it better. That was our family. Robert provided the framework of the universe, and I provided the comfort within it. We didn't have much, but we had everything. Then when Michael was in his late 20s, he brought Catherine home for dinner. The moment she stepped into our small house, the atmosphere changed. It wasn't just the expensive, sharp perfume that seemed to invade every corner, a scent so different from the familiar cedar and old paper of our lives. It was her eyes. They scanned everything: the worn armchair where Robert read, the slightly faded curtains I had sewn myself, the mismatched plates on our dinner table. "Oh, Eleanor," she said, her voice a smooth, polished melody that didn't quite ring true. "Your home is so authentic. It's just wonderful that you're not caught up in all that tiresome decorating." There it was, the first one, a compliment shaped like a kindness but functioning as a judgment. She saw our life not as something chosen and loved, but as something lacking. That night I saw the path ahead stretching out, and a small cold knot formed in my stomach. Michael was utterly besotted. He saw her ambition as drive, her materialism as a desire for a better life, and I, who loved my son more than my own breath, wanted him to be happy. So I smiled. I served the roast I had spent all day cooking, and I tried to ignore the way Catherine held her wine glass, as if she were afraid to touch anything on our table. A few months later, she let her mask slip just for a moment. We were in the kitchen, and I was telling a story about my own mother, how she could make a week's worth of meals from a single chicken. Catherine's face hardened. "My mother used to cry over the gas bill," she said, her voice stripped of its usual polish. "The kids at school, they had designer jeans. I had hand-me-downs. The seams were always in the wrong place. I remember watching my mother get patronized by the woman at the grocery store when she used food stamps, the humiliation on her face. I swore," she finished, her voice a blade of ice, "that would never be me, and it will never be my children." In that moment, I understood her. I didn't approve, but I saw the ghost that haunted her. The fear of being poor, of being looked down upon, of being humiliated. Her whole life was a performance designed to prove she had escaped that fate. The tragedy was that in building her fortress against the world's judgment, she had walled off her own heart. When she and Michael decided to get married, the financial ledger of my life began to be written in earnest. They wanted a grand affair, something memorable, as Catherine put it. The venue alone cost more than Robert and I had earned in a year. "We just need a little help to get started, Mom," Michael said, his eyes avoiding mine. I had a small savings account, money Robert and I had painstakingly put aside for decades. It was my what if fund. What if the roof leaks? What if the car dies for good? What if one of us gets sick? Robert used to pat my hand and say, "This is for a real emergency, Ellie." I looked at my son, at the desperate hope in his eyes, and I thought, my son's happiness feels like an emergency. I went to the bank the next day and withdrew $50,000, nearly all of it. The check felt impossibly heavy in my hand. That was the first entry. A year later, they wanted to buy a house, not a starter home, but a sprawling new construction in a gated community an hour away. It had a 3-car garage and a media room. Catherine had her eye on it, had already picked out the paint colors. They were, of course, short on the down payment. "It's an investment, Mom," Michael argued, echoing words I was sure Catherine had fed him. "The property values are only going up." This time, my savings account wasn't enough. I had to sell some of the bonds I had inherited from my own parents, the nest egg that was meant to see me through my own old age. I sat in the financial advisor's office, the pen shaking in my hand as I signed the papers. The advisor, a kind man who had known my parents, looked at me with concern. "Are you sure about this, Eleanor?" I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. $150,000. The second, much larger entry. The ledger grew over the years. $10,000 for a new car when Michael's broke down because Catherine was embarrassed to have him driving a 10-year-old sedan. $25,000 to cover Catherine's credit card debt after a small business venture selling imported handbags collapsed. She called it a bridging loan, a term I was sure she'd learned from a magazine. It was never mentioned again, let alone paid back. Little amounts here and there, for school trips for my granddaughter, Lily, for a new furnace, for landscaping. Each request came with a gloss of logic, but underneath it was the same relentless pressure. Over 15 years, it added up. I knew the total because I had written it down, not in a ledger like Robert's, but on a single sheet of paper I kept in my bedside table. $235,000, a number that felt like a lifetime of careful saving, of turning down the thermostat, of making my own clothes, of living simply so my son could live grandly. Through it all, I never touched Robert's garden. It felt sacred, a part of him I had to protect. Catherine and Michael knew nothing about it. They saw me as a retired librarian's assistant living on a widow's pension in a small old house. They saw me as a resource, but a finite one, a well that was beginning to run dry. On the wall in my living room hung a small framed print. It was a diagram Robert had drawn for one of his patents, a beautiful, intricate web of lines and symbols that looked like abstract art. Catherine had noticed it once, years ago. "Is that a doodle, Eleanor?" she'd asked, her nose wrinkled slightly. "You should really get some proper art. It would do wonders for this room." I just smiled and said, "I like it. It reminds me of Robert." She shrugged and moved on, never giving it another thought. Robert passed away 5 years ago. His mind, that brilliant, vibrant engine, had slowly wound down. In his last lucid moments, he gripped my hand. His voice was a dry whisper, but his eyes were clear. "The box, Ellie," he breathed, "the cedar box. The key is in my desk drawer. When you need it. Not before. When you truly need it." I had nodded, thinking he was talking about old letters or photographs. I put the key in my jewelry box and didn't think about it again. I didn't think I would ever need it. I thought I had family. And that brings us back to the hospital, to the smell of antiseptic and the cold, hard gleam of the linoleum floor. I had fallen, a simple misstep on my own porch, a patch of moss I hadn't seen. The pain in my hip had been sharp and immediate, a sickening crack that echoed in the quiet afternoon. An ambulance had been called, and now here I was, propped up on starchy pillows, feeling fragile and old. Catherine and Michael had arrived an hour ago. Michael, at least, had the grace to look worried, his face pale, but Catherine radiated an air of profound inconvenience. Her perfectly plucked eyebrows were drawn together in a frown, not of concern for me, but of annoyance with the disruption to her day. Her questions were all brisk and logistical. "How long will she be here?" she'd asked the doctor, as if I were a package to be delivered. "What's the insurance situation? Will she need rehab?" Then the nurse, a young woman with kind eyes and a tired smile, came in with a clipboard. "Mrs. Vance," she began, speaking to me directly, a small courtesy for which I was suddenly grateful. "For your discharge planning, we need a list of emergency contacts, family members who can help coordinate your care when you go home." Before I could even open my mouth, Catherine stepped forward, physically placing herself between me and the nurse. She gave the nurse a tight, professional smile. "I can handle this," she said, taking the clipboard. Her pen, a slim gold one, hovered over the paper. The nurse clarified, "So for family contacts besides your son, is there anyone else we should list? A daughter, a sibling?" And that's when she said it. Catherine didn't even look at me. She looked at the nurse, her expression one of weary patience. "She doesn't have any family we need to contact, no." The world narrowed to a tunnel. The only sound was the rhythmic electronic beep of the heart monitor beside my bed. Beep, beep, beep. A steady metronome counting out the seconds of my new solitary existence. I watched the nurse's pen move. I could see the shape of the word she wrote in the small box. None. I looked at my son. Michael flinched. I saw it. A tremor went through him. He opened his mouth, a protest forming on his lips. But then Catherine shot him a look. It was instantaneous, a flash of pure, cold command, and Michael's mouth closed. He looked down at his hands, his shoulders slumping in defeat. And that more than Catherine's lie was what shattered me. Her cruelty was a known quantity. His silence was a fresh betrayal, a renunciation of everything we had ever been. Just then a figure appeared in the doorway. It was my granddaughter, Lily, her cheeks flushed from running down the hospital corridor. She was holding a small wilting bouquet of daisies from the hospital gift shop. She was 16, a girl caught between the child she was and the woman she was becoming, and her face still showed everything she felt. She had heard it. I saw the words land on her, saw the shock and disbelief in her wide eyes. "That's not true," she burst out, her young voice cracking with outrage. "Grandma has us. She has me." Catherine spun around, her face a mask of fury. "Lily, the adults are talking," she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "Go wait in the hall." Lily looked from her mother's angry face to my son's averted one, and then to me, lying small and silent in the big bed. Her face crumpled and tears welled in her eyes. She turned and fled. In the silence that followed, something inside me shifted. The pain, the shock, the grief, it all began to cool and harden, coalescing into something new. It was a cold, quiet clarity. I was not a mother anymore, not in any way that mattered. I was not a grandmother. I was a problem to be managed, a line item on a budget that they had decided was no longer viable. I looked at Catherine's perfectly manicured nails, at the expensive watch on her wrist, at the disdain that settled so naturally on her face. And I remembered Robert's last words: "The box, when you need it, not before." Lying there, erased and discarded in that sterile room. I looked at the ceiling and thought, with a calm that surprised me, I need it now. The 2 days in the hospital were a blur of tests and physical therapy, but underneath the routine, a new resolve was setting in my bones. When they discharged me, Michael drove me home. Catherine, thankfully, was not with him. The car ride was thick with an unbearable silence. He kept glancing at me, his mouth opening and closing as if he wanted to say something, but the words never came. He was a stranger to me now, a man I had once known intimately, whose every childhood fear and dream I had held in my heart. Now there was a chasm between us, and he lacked the courage to even call across it. When we pulled up to my small house, he helped me out of the car, his touch tentative and uncertain. "Mom, about what Catherine said," he began, his voice barely a whisper. I held up a hand. "Not now, Michael." He flinched as if I'd slapped him. He walked me to the door, handed me my small bag, and left. He didn't even come inside. I stood at my front door and watched his expensive car disappear down the street, the silence of its smooth engine a final damning statement. My house, my sanctuary, felt different. It was no longer just a repository of memories, but a fortress waiting to be reclaimed. The air inside was still, smelling of my life, cedar from the closet, old paper from the books, a faint hint of the lemon polish I used on the tables. I limped through the familiar rooms, my hip aching with a dull throb that was nothing compared to the ache in my chest. I went straight to my bedroom, to the small ornate jewelry box where I kept the key. It was small and brass, cold to the touch. I pulled a chair over to the closet, my movements slow and deliberate. Reaching up to the top shelf, my fingers brushed against the smooth, cool wood of the cedar box. It was heavier than I expected. I carried it to my bed and sat down, my heart thudding against my ribs. For a moment, I just looked at it. A simple wooden box held together by time and my husband's foresight. With a trembling hand, I put the key in the lock and turned. The click was soft, but it echoed in the quiet room. I lifted the lid. It wasn't filled with old letters or photographs. It was filled with paper, stacks of it. On top was a single, sealed envelope with my name, Eleanor, written in Robert's neat architectural script. Beneath that were dozens of thick, formal-looking documents, stock certificates, bound by rubber bands that had grown brittle with age, and underneath those, several of Robert's leather-bound ledgers, just like the one I'd seen him writing in all those years ago. My hand shook as I opened the first ledger. The pages were filled with Robert's precise handwriting. Dates, company names, number of shares, purchase price, page after page of it. Intel, Cisco Systems, Apple Computer, names that were now giants, but which he had bought when they were acorns. He had never sold a single share. He had just kept planting his garden. At the very bottom of the box, tucked into a corner, was a slim, elegant business card. It was made of heavy, cream-colored stock, the lettering embossed in a deep blue. Julian Davies, it read, founding partner, Sterling Bridge Private Wealth. Below the name was a phone number. My first call was not to Mr. Davies, it was to a locksmith. A cheerful young man came an hour later, whistling as he worked. He replaced the locks on my front and back doors, handing me a set of new shiny keys. "There you go, ma'am," he said, "safe and sound." The simple, solid weight of those new keys in my palm was the first real comfort I had felt in days. It was a tangible piece of my new reality. I was locking the world out, yes, but I was also locking myself in, securing the perimeter of my own life. The next morning I sat at my kitchen table, the cedar box open before me, and dialed the number on the business card. A polite, professional voice answered. "I asked for Mr. Julian Davies. May I ask who is calling?" "My name is Eleanor Vance. My husband was Robert Vance." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then the voice returned, warmer this time. "Please hold one moment for Mr. Davies, Mrs. Vance." A moment later, a deep, calm voice came on the line. "Mrs. Vance, this is Julian Davies. It is an honor to hear from you. I was a great admirer of your husband." I arranged a meeting for the following afternoon. His office was downtown in a tall building of glass and steel that seemed to scrape the sky. The lobby was a cathedral of marble and silence. I felt small and out of place in my simple wool coat and my worn canvas tote bag, the same one I'd carried for years with a faded museum logo on the side from a trip Robert and I took the year Michael was born. Mr. Davies's office was on the top floor. It didn't smell like a modern office. It smelled of leather and old paper and the rich, dark aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled not with financial thrillers but with volumes on history and science. Julian Davies himself was a man in his late 60s, with kind eyes and a reassuring calm. He stood up as I entered, his hand outstretched. "Mrs. Vance, please come in. It has been a long time." He had known Robert not just as a client, but as a friend. They had shared a passion for obscure scientific history. I placed the ledgers on his vast mahogany desk. He opened the first one, his expression reverent. He ran his finger down a page, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Ah, yes," he murmured. "I remember this. Robert called me from a payphone at the university. He'd just read a paper about a new method for etching silicon wafers. He said, 'Julian, buy as much of this little company as you can.' We thought he was mad. The company had 3 employees. He looked up at me. That little company was Intel, Mrs. Vance. He spent the next hour with the ledgers, his assistant bringing us coffee in delicate porcelain cups. He would occasionally let out a soft whistle or a quiet, 'My goodness, Robert.' Finally, he leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped behind his head. He looked at me, his professional composure gone, replaced by a look of sheer awe. 'Mrs. Vance, Eleanor, did you have any idea?' I knew he had a hobby," I whispered, my voice feeling thin and reedy in the vast, quiet office. He laughed, a rich, genuine sound. "A hobby? Yes, I suppose you could call it that. Your husband, the quiet physics professor, was one of the most brilliant investors I have ever known. He wasn't a gambler, he was a visionary. He didn't bet on stocks, he bet on the future. And he was never, ever wrong. He swiveled his chair to his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He turned the large monitor toward me. It was covered in columns of names and numbers. "We have managed this portfolio according to his original instructions," Mr. Davies explained. "Let it grow," he always said. "We have reinvested the dividends, managed the splits. We have been the gardeners, as he would have put it." He pointed to a number at the bottom of the screen, a very, very long number, The room tilted. The number was so large it seemed unreal, a string of digits with no connection to the physical world. I saw the cost of my house, the price of my car, the sum of my grocery bills for a lifetime, and they were all just dust motes compared to this. I gripped the arms of the leather chair, my knuckles turning white. I felt a wave of dizziness, the same feeling I had had when I fell, a sense of the world shifting beneath my feet. My husband's hobby, I said again, the words feeling utterly inadequate. Mr. Davies smiled, a gentle, understanding expression on his face. His hobby, he said softly, built an empire. He then explained the structure. Robert had established a trust years ago, with me as the sole trustee. He had also set up the framework for a charitable foundation in his name. It was all there, waiting. He opened a drawer in his desk and took out a slim black card. It was made of some kind of metal, heavy and cool to the touch. It was featureless except for the Sterling Bridge logo embossed in a subtle matte gray. "This is your client card, Eleanor," he said. "It gives you direct access to the funds and to our firm's highest level of service. There are very few of these in the world." He slid it across the desk. I picked it up. It felt like a weapon. My next set of instructions for Mr. Davies was simple and precise. "First," I said, my voice steadier now, "I want you to cancel all automatic transfers from any of my accounts to Michael Vance or Catherine Vance." "Done," he said, making a note. "Second, I want you to begin the process of fully activating the Robert Vance Foundation. It would be our honor. And third, I believe my daughter-in-law may be attempting to file for conservatorship over my affairs. She believes I am incompetent." Mr. Davis's kind expression hardened. "Let her try," he said, his voice turning to steel. "We will be ready." I left his office feeling like a different woman. The city streets, which had seemed so intimidating on the way in, now felt vibrant and full of possibility. On the way home, I did something I hadn't done in years. I told the taxi driver to stop at a nursery, a high-end one I had only ever window shopped at. I walked in and bought the most beautiful, extravagant orchid I could find, a magnificent phalaenopsis with blossoms the color of a deep sunset. It was a thing of pure, unapologetic beauty. I carried it home and placed it on my windowsill, where the afternoon sun made its petals glow. It was a small victory, a declaration that my life was now my own. The first counterattack came 2 days later. It was a phone call from Michael. "Mom, the transfer for our mortgage. It didn't go through. Did you forget to do it? Is everything okay?" His voice was laced with a carefully constructed casualness that didn't quite hide the panic underneath. "Everything is fine, Michael," I said, my voice calm. "I am simply reviewing my finances." There was a pause, and then I heard Catherine's voice in the background, sharp and impatient. Then she was on the line. "Eleanor, what is going on?" "Michael is worried sick. Honestly, after your fall, it's perfectly understandable if you're getting a little confused. Maybe it's time we helped you manage these things." The condescension, the gaslighting, it was so familiar, but this time it didn't find its mark. It bounced off the new armor I was wearing. "Thank you for your concern, Catherine," I said, my voice as cool and smooth as river stone. "But I am perfectly capable of managing my own affairs." And I hung up. The silence in my kitchen was profound. The only sound was the gentle ticking of the clock on the wall, a sound I had lived with for 40 years. For the first time, it sounded like a countdown. The second attack was more formal. A week later, a thick envelope arrived by courier. It was from a law firm I didn't recognize. Inside was a petition filed in family court. Catherine and Michael were seeking temporary conservatorship over my estate, citing my recent fall, subsequent confusion, and erratic financial behavior. They had included a statement from a doctor I had never met, who attested that a woman of my age, after such a trauma, was likely to be incapable of sound judgment. My hands trembled as I read the words, not from fear, but from a cold, rising fury. They were trying to erase me legally now, to turn me into a non-person under the law, all to get their hands on what they thought was a modest little pension. I called Mr. Davies. I read him the letter. He was silent for a long moment. The audacity, he finally said, his voice tight. Eleanor, do not worry. Send that letter to my office. Our legal team will handle this. They will find it is a very, very different matter to file a frivolous petition against a Sterling Bridge client than it is against a helpless old woman. A few days later, a follow-up appointment for my hip took me back to the hospital. The place no longer felt like a prison. It was just a building. While waiting, I wandered down a quiet corridor and found a small room with a sign that said Volunteer Library. Inside, an older woman with a kind, wrinkled face was sorting through a cart of donated books. She smiled at me as I browsed the shelves. I picked up a tattered old copy of Great Expectations. The cover was nearly torn off. Funny, isn't it? The woman said, not looking up from her work. People see a torn cover and think the story's ruined. They get rid of it, but the story's still all there. She held up a plain-looking hardcover. I was a librarian for 40 years. People always want the shiny new books. But the real first editions, the ones with the real value, they often look plain. Simple cloth covers, no fancy pictures. It's what's inside that holds the value. She looked at me then, her gaze direct and knowing. You can't ever judge a book by its cover, can you? No, I said, my voice thick. You can't. The best stories, she added, placing a book gently on a shelf, always have a little justice in them. Doesn't make the sad parts not happen, but it makes them make sense. I left the hospital that day, feeling that a stranger had somehow seen directly into my soul. The final piece of my resolve clicked into place. The phone call that set the final act in motion came not from Michael or Catherine, but from Lily. She called me late one night, her voice choked with tears. Grandma, she sobbed, I can't stand it. Mom she's awful. What is it, sweetheart? What's happened? It's this party, she said. This huge, fancy charity dinner. Mom's the co-chair. It's all she talks about. She's getting a new dress. She's been on the phone for weeks planning. And her friends, they asked about you. And she told them you were unwell, that you were having age-related difficulties and couldn't possibly attend. She took a ragged breath. She's telling everyone you're crazy, Grandma, so they won't question it when she takes over your money. A stage. Catherine was building herself a stage upon which she would perform her final act of compassionate, concerned daughter-in-law, and she was making sure the audience was primed to believe her story. An idea, cold and clear and perfect, formed in my mind. Lily, I said, my voice perfectly calm, don't you worry. Can you do something for me? Anything, Grandma. Can you tell me the date and the time and the name of the hotel where this dinner is being held? The night of the gala arrived a week later. A storm had rolled in, and rain lashed against my windows. Inside, my house was quiet and warm. I stood in my bedroom in the soft light of the lamp on my nightstand. I wasn't looking at dresses. I was looking at a photograph. It was an old faded picture of Michael, taken on his 5th birthday. He was holding up a slightly squashed frog he'd caught by the creek, his smile a triumphant, gap-toothed beacon of pure joy. I remembered that day so clearly. The feel of the sun on my arms, the smell of damp earth, the sheer, uncomplicated weight of his love. I remembered the feeling of him falling asleep on my shoulder on the walk home, a dead weight of absolute trust, a wave of grief so powerful it almost buckled my knees, washed over me. This was my son, my little boy. The man I was preparing to confront was still, somewhere inside, that child. Was I about to destroy him? Was this justice, or was it a terrible, cold revenge that would burn down the last vestiges of my own family? The question hung in the silent room, heavy and unanswerable. For a long, painful moment, I considered calling Mr. Davis and telling him to stop everything. I could just let it go. I could retreat into my quiet life, Let them have their victory. It would be easier. Then, as clearly as if she were standing behind me, I heard Catherine's voice in my memory. She doesn't have any family, and I saw Michael's face, his brief flicker of protest extinguished by a single glance from his wife. He hadn't just been silent, he had been complicit. He had chosen her version of reality over the truth of our lives. The insult wasn't just to me, it was to the memory of Robert. It was a desecration of the love and sacrifice that had built the very ground they stood on. The grief receded, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. This wasn't about destroying my son. It was about forcing him to see the man he had become. I turned to my closet and took out the dress I had already chosen. It was a simple, charcoal gray sheath dress I'd owned for years. Well made, timeless, and utterly unremarkable. I put on my most comfortable, sensible shoes. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. My gray hair was pulled back in its usual simple bun. I wore no makeup, no jewelry, except for my thin gold wedding band. I looked exactly like who they thought I was, a quiet, frugal old woman, a relic, good. My eyes fell on the wall where the framed patent diagram had hung. It was now wrapped in a soft cloth inside my canvas tote bag. My old, familiar tote. I picked it up, along with my simple wool coat. Then I picked up my keys. The small, solid weight in my palm was no longer just a comfort. It was a promise. The storm outside raged, but inside me there was a great and profound calm. The taxi dropped me at the entrance to the Grand Regent Hotel. A river of expensive cars was flowing toward the valet, depositing men in tuxedos and women in glittering gowns. I paid the driver, took a deep breath of the rain-washed air, and walked through the gleaming revolving doors. The ballroom was a spectacle of calculated opulence. It smelled of money, a cloying mix of expensive perfume, rich food, and the faint metallic scent of ambition. Crystal chandeliers, the size of small cars, dripped light onto a sea of elegantly dressed people. A string quartet was playing something by Vivaldi in the corner, their music a tasteful, unobtrusive soundtrack to the murmur of self-important conversation. And in the center of it all, holding court, was Catherine. She was breathtaking. She wore a shimmering, backless gown of silver sequins that clung to her like a second skin. Diamonds glittered at her throat and ears. She moved through the crowd with the easy grace of a queen in her own palace, laughing, touching arms, her face alight with triumph. This was her element, the stage she had built for herself, and she was the star. Michael stood beside her, looking handsome but stiff in his tuxedo, a handsome prop for her performance. He held a glass of champagne and smiled when she smiled. Then she saw me. For a fraction of a second her smile froze, a flicker of pure, unadulterated shock, followed by a wave of fury. But she was a professional. The mask slammed back into place so quickly that if I hadn't been watching for it, I would have missed it. She excused herself from her circle of admirers and glided toward me, her sequined dress whispering across the thick carpet. "Eleanor!" she exclaimed, her voice a symphony of false warmth. "What on earth are you doing here? We were so worried. We thought you were at home, resting." She put her hand on my arm, her grip surprisingly strong, and tried to steer me toward the back of the room. "It's so loud in here. Let me find you a quiet little table in the corner where you can be comfortable." She was trying to hide me, to marginalize me before I could become a problem. I gently but firmly removed her hand from my arm and planted my feet. "No, thank you, Catherine," I said, my voice quiet but clear. "I wouldn't want to miss the speeches. I'd like to stay right here." Her eyes narrowed. The smile became a thin, hard line. "As you wish," she hissed, and turned her back on me, gliding back to her throne in the center of the room. The dinner was an ordeal of bland food and self-congratulatory speeches. I sat at a table in the back with some junior executives who ignored me completely. It was perfect. I was invisible, just as Catherine wanted. Finally, the moment arrived. The lights dimmed slightly, and the master of ceremonies, a local news anchor, introduced the co-chair of the evening's fundraising committee, Catherine Vance. She walked to the stage to a round of enthusiastic applause, a vision in silver. She stood at the lectern, bathed in the warm glow of a single spotlight. She spoke beautifully, her voice resonating with passion and sincerity. She talked about the importance of community, of giving back, of building a legacy for our children. She spoke of the importance of family foundations and looking after those who can no longer look after themselves. It was a masterful performance. As she finished to another wave of applause, a strange thing happened. The event organizer, a flustered looking man with a clipboard, hurried onto the stage. He whispered something in Catherine's ear. She shook her head, an annoyed expression on her face. He whispered again, more urgently this time, his voice audible in the sudden lull. Ma'am, the card you provided for your personal pledge. It was declined. A ripple went through the crowd. Catherine's face, which had been flushed with triumph, drained of all color. The blood left her face so completely she looked like a marble statue. She looked out at the sea of faces, her mouth opening and closing silently. The public humiliation was absolute, a spotlight far harsher than the one she had sought. Into that deafening, exquisite silence I moved. I walked from the back of the room, my sensible shoes making no sound on the plush carpet. I walked to the small set of stairs at the side of the stage and climbed them. I moved to the lectern next to the frozen figure of my daughter-in-law. I took the microphone. My voice, when I spoke, did not tremble. It was not the voice of a frail old woman asking for permission to exist. It was the voice of Eleanor Vance, clear, steady, and resonant. It filled every corner of the silent ballroom. Catherine, I began, my voice gentle, that was a beautiful speech about legacy. I turned to the audience. My daughter-in-law and my son Michael have built such a successful life, a beautiful house, wonderful vacations, a fine education for my granddaughter. They are a testament to what hard work can achieve. I turned back to Catherine. Her eyes were wide with a dawning horror. I was just doing a little accounting of my own recently, I continued, my voice conversational, and it made me think about foundations. Catherine, could you remind the audience how much the down payment was on your lovely house in Oak Ridge? I seem to recall it was a rather large sum. She stared at me, speechless. The entire room was holding its breath. No, let me help you, I said. It was $150,000, a gift from Robert and me. A collective gasp went through the room. I could see Michael in the crowd, his face ashen. And your wedding, I went on, my voice gaining strength. So beautiful. That was $50,000. And then there were cars and debts and tuition. Over the years, my husband Robert and I, from his modest professor's salary, gave you and Michael $250,000